Hey everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 27th episode of the Writ Podcast. We're going to be just 132 days from the Ontario election, even less before the campaign gets started. So I wanted to check in with Sabrina and Nanji of Queen's Park Observer about this election year as it's just getting started. You can check out her newsletter at qpobserver.com. She's been giving us some updates on the podcast over the last few months, but she's here for a more in-depth conversation. Sabrina, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, the legislature isn't sitting right now, and it's not coming back for a little while. When it was sitting just before the holiday break, what was the feeling like there? Did it feel like everybody was just waiting until the next election, or was it tense? What was the mood like at Queen's Park?
It's felt like everyone's been in campaign mode for the last few months, whether or not the House is sitting. I mean, of course, when the House is sitting, we've got question period, debates, and it was getting a bit, feisty. The Premier, Doug Ford, he's not there all the time, but he kind of gives us a few hints of, some campaign slogans or where they're ridings they're gunning for. He was like hitting really hard against the NDP's representative for Windsor. Maybe we can get into that a little bit more, but yeah, a lot of vitriol going back and forth. Even there's been advertising coming out from all parties, more so the NDP and the PCs. I think we saw a bit of that because now the parties are subject to limits on how much they spend, because we're sort of in that pre-writ period right now. It's only less than 5 months to the campaign, so there's ads. We've seen some election promises, some hints at platform promises coming down, some bold promises from the Liberals. Everyone's been fundraising like crazy. We know the limits are going up again this year. Fundraising events are back. Obviously, the pandemic has kind of thrown a wrench into this, but it hasn't really stopped the parties from calling people. I just heard a couple of the PCs making calls today. They've been canvassing, knocking on doors. A lot. Everyone's fully in campaign mode right now, and even me too. Everyone's nominating candidates. All the issues are coming out. The polls are already gauging what the electorate thinks is going to be important. I think we saw one this week from Abacus data. Obviously the pandemic is top of mind, cost of living, housing affordability, and now we're starting to see the parties kind of shift maybe to talk about those issues a bit more. So yeah, get ready for a ride. I think it's just going to keep getting more intense as we move ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned the polls. I think before we get into where the party stand, I do want to talk a little bit about that, because we're recording this on Thursday, and just in the last 24 hours or so, we've seen 4 polls come out, and it's not exactly clear what they're showing. We had numbers that came out from Abacus data and Ecos research, more or less showing 8 or 9 point lead for the PCs over either the Liberals or the NDP, who are tied in second. Which was a bit of a surprise because we had seen some approval rating numbers for Doug Ford that seemed to be going down. But then we got a poll from Main Street Research that had the PCs only at 31%. They were only, just looking at the numbers here, 3 points ahead of the NDP, it was the Liberals who were in second and the NDP in third. But then this morning, Thursday morning, we got an Angus Reid Institute poll that had the New Democrats at 36% and the PCs at 33% and the Liberals at 19%. I mean, you look at all these numbers and it's really hard to know what's actually going on. Like, when you have been talking to people at Queen's Park, which sets of numbers do you think lines up with where people actually think things are?
I think what these polls are telling us is just that it's kind of anybody's game right now. I think there were a few surprises. I think one thing that the Conservatives definitely aren't happy about is the Premier's personal approval rating. I mean, it's virtually in the toilet right now, hovering around 30%, let's just say generally from the polls that we saw this week. We know that he swept a majority at Queen's Park with about 40% of the vote. So, his personal brand is suffering, but the PC party itself is doing better than him. And I think we've also kind of seen that on the Liberal side of things too. Maybe people don't know too much about the new-ish leader, Steven Del Duca, or, what they do know, he's got a lot of political baggage. But the Liberal brand is doing well. I think, the Angus Reid poll that came out today with putting the NDP on top, I think was very surprising. It did seem like a bit of an outlier, but I think, it just feels like anybody's game for June when the election is scheduled right now. I think every party has something that they're taking away from these polls, obviously. I think that what stood out to me is that it just seems that the PCs are, they're probably in good shape, generally speaking. Obviously, the pandemic is weighing on that. But I think that they right now they're feeling pretty confident. It's just whether or not they can actually get that majority again. And of course, things could change. One of our colleagues at CBC, Mike Crawley, actually had a great scoop on internal government polling, and there was a lot of juicy tidbits in there, but one of the big things was that anytime the pandemic situation is bad, hospitalizations are up, schools are closed, businesses are locked down. Unsurprisingly, support for the governing party goes down. So I think that depending on the pandemic situation in June, that could spell trouble again for the Conservatives. I mean, who knows what will happen there? I think something else that stood out to me is the support for other parties. And there's not always specifics in the polls, but we know that there are fringe parties out there that have emerged now. Ontario First, the New Blues, sort of this anti-lockdown crowd has kind of galvanized these spin-off parties, former Tories as well. So I think it will be interesting. They do have like a minimal amount of support in these polls, right? Like less than 5%. But I think it will be interesting to see how this plays out. We kind of always talk about vote splitting on the so-called left or left of center with the NDP and the Liberals, and we'll see if that happens, with the Tories and some of those spin-offs. I don't know if anyone's really sweating these parties, but I think it'll be interesting to see how much support they get. Obviously, I don't know if your anti-lockdown stance, who knows what the situation will be in the spring, if that can actually bring people out to the polls, but you only need about 4% of the vote to get a per vote subsidy, where you're getting some taxpayer money, and obviously money helps campaigns, helps political parties. So I think that's going to be one story to watch. I think, right now it'll be up to each party to kind of take what they want out of these polls, but they'll tell you, the only poll that really matters is the one on election day.
Yes, of course. I hear that all the time. That's interesting, the 4% for the subsidy, because the People's Party did get just over 4% in Ontario in the federal election. So if one of those parties, and there's another one also, Derek Sloan, who has come back from Alberta when he was there for a little while to run for as an independent Alberta, is going to be running the Ontario party. So there's going to be lots of competition. I'm not sure if any of them is going to be able to galvanize 4%. And the thing about the pandemic that you mentioned, how the government's numbers go up and down. One of the things that I think was kind of notable about these polls is that the ones that were done before it was announced or leaked that the schools would be coming back as scheduled have worse numbers for the PCs than the Abacus and Ecos polls that was done a little bit after that. So I wonder if that's one of the factors we're seeing, that, the announcement that the schools would be returning on time kind of signaled to a lot of people that, okay, things are getting better and the government's not flip-flopping again. Maybe that has helped them. So, maybe that's the kind of thing we're going to be seeing in the next few months as the pandemic goes up and down, that the PC numbers might kind of match people's mood about the pandemic.
Yeah, it's interesting because, some, I guess you could argue, some in the PC base might not be, they're business minded, maybe more so than other parties. And I think, lockdowns, maybe not the most popular thing, but I think that the Conservatives, from what I'm hearing, their internal polling shows that, generally, obviously when the COVID situation is bad, lockdowns are popular with the public. I think we've seen that even in public polls as well. So it's interesting to see how their policies are kind of playing out. And of course, you mentioned like these announcements that are kind of leaks and announcements, they seem to be trial balloons of sorts. As a reporter, it's very frustrating, to kind of just chase rumors. But I do think that, this tends to happen a lot where they float these, even this week, we've had these leaks about restaurants reopening in a couple of weeks for indoor dining. We're seeing the feedback from that. We're going to get the official announcement. So, it's really just up to us to, I guess, optics wise, it kind of looks like they are tailoring their response a bit to public response. And obviously that's not the only factor here in this decision making, but politics is kind of informing all of this, but behind the scenes.
Oh, shocker. But anyway, so, you did mention that the PCs seem to be kind of confident going into the election. So my question, though, is who do they see as their primary opponent? Because with the exception of that Angus Reid poll that clearly had the NDP being, the main opposition, we're more or less seeing polls showing the Liberals and the New Democrats tied, maybe a point or two or three separating them. So from the PC perspective, who will they be campaigning against?
I mean, we have seen ads from them, attacking NDP leader Andrea Horwath and Liberal leader Steven Del Duca, but Del Duca is shaping up to be the man to beat in 2022 right now. Even I would argue for the NDP too. I think you mentioned, that they're kind of neck and neck, statistically speaking, with the NDP in most of those polls. And I think most Ontarians probably identify themselves maybe as like a small L Liberal. So the party brand has really upheld itself. Obviously, 2018, that's a whole other episode for us to get into that, but that was like a change election. It was the PCs essentially to win. And now they're gunning for after Del Duca. I mean, in those advertising blitzes that we had seen a couple of months ago, they were tying him to Kathleen Wynne. We know she had a lot of unpopular decisions. They were trounced in 2018, decimated to 7 seats. They put out ads, calling Del Duca Kathleen Wynne's right-hand man. He was there at the cabinet table, making these unpopular decisions like partially privatizing Hydro One. And they have done that with Andrea Horwath, but I think it's more intense with Del Duca. When there was all this controversy around the funding for the Hamilton LRT, still controversy happening there. They had these like clips of Steven Del Duca announcing the money and criticizing him, like ready to go on social media. So I think he is shaping up to be the man to beat right now. The polls, I think a lot of people don't know Del Duca enough, or what they do know, they don't really like. So I think we're going to see a lot of reminders about his political baggage. He tried to bypass local environmental protection rules to get a pool built in his backyard. They kind of, all the things that people don't like about Liberals, elitist, insidery, like helping out their buddies. We're going to see a lot of that talk coming from them. I think Del Duca, his line is that he takes it as a compliment. But I do think that, he's got his own issues to work on. I don't think the Liberals will mind if I say that, some of their internal polling has suggested that women in particular actually don't like Del Duca that much. And he's not the most charismatic guy either. He's kind of made those self-deprecating jokes that he's not so charming. I think he actually does well when he kind of can laugh at himself. But I think that, defining Del Duca is going to be a big thing for all the political parties now.
Yeah, when there's a vacuum in terms of knowledge, all the other parties are going to rush to try to fill that vacuum in the most negative way. And I guess if you are the PCs, if you're looking at the numbers, you might conclude that the NDP is going to have a lot more trouble growing than maybe the Liberals. So trying to keep the Liberals down would probably make some sense. But if the PCs are looking at, the map, based on where the polls are, it's mostly a defensive game, right? They're not expecting to be able to pick up seats, except for maybe a few individual cases. But in terms of, if they can still come out of this with 65, 70 seats, I'm sure they'd be happy, even if if it would represent a loss from 2018. But for the PCs, where is ground zero for them? Where is the place that if they lose the government?
Well, that's kind of the interesting thing here, because they're obviously, campaigning hard against the Liberals and Del Duca. But I think the areas where they could pick up is NDP territory. So they've been pushing hard in the north. They've been pushing hard in Windsor, the Windsor Essex area, especially Windsor. They've had their candidates, nominated months ago. And the NDP is losing some incumbents over there as well. And I think that area, there's kind of this interesting, cross section of voters. There's a lot of blue collar workers there that would swing between the NDP and the Conservatives rather than go Liberal. I think also the GTA, we can't really forget about that. I think Toronto proper, downtown, I think that's maybe more of an NDP Liberal battle. But I think on the outskirts of that. We can get into Ajax and Rod Phillips, high profile PC minister bowing out. But I think like on the outskirts of Toronto, I know Scarborough Centre is one that they're kind of worried about losing. They don't have an incumbent there running now. Christina Midas, stepping down to spend time with her family. And these have previously been territory of the Liberals. So I think, they might lose a couple of GTA seats, but they're going to push hard in, Windsor, the north as well, which is NDP territory too.
You kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier with those other parties, the New Blues, the Ontario First, the Ontario Party. Do you get any sense that the PCs are concerned about them at all?
I guess it depends on who you talk to. I don't think that they see them as an actual real threat. I think maybe in some of the ridings where they had lost incumbents, you mentioned Derek Sloan and the Ontario Party, like Rick Nichols has been a long time. He's crossed, he didn't get vaccinated and was booted out. So he's an independent now, but has sided with Derek Sloan, says he's not going to run again. But I think it's those ridings. Obviously Randy Hillier, he's out. The New Blues, Belinda Karahalios in Cambridge. I think maybe they're worried about those seats, but they kind of don't really have them now. They've lost, a bunch of incumbents, either who got booted or kicked out or crossed the floor, or they're not running again. So I think that's really where they're going to be worried. But in terms of stealing seats, I don't think so. I think one interesting spot actually is York Centre. Roman Baber, who former PC, taken an anti-lockdown stance, got kicked out. He hasn't really said formally whether he'll run again, but again, kind of in the GTA, those spots, it might be a little more competitive for them than they would like.
Ajax, you mentioned that being one of those in the GTA. Rod Phillips not running again seemed to have come as a bit of a surprise. What was your take on what was behind that and what it means for the PCs?
I think everyone was shocked by that. The Premier's office, we had seen Rod Phillips, do these flashy photo ops with the Premier just a few days before. So I think no one really saw that coming. It's a huge blow politically to the Conservatives. But I think, that's because Rod Phillips, he's been a steady hand at the cabinet table. He's been credited with, obviously long-term care is, struggling again right now, but he was credited with kind of bringing it out of, some of the trouble that through the pandemic, there's legislation for building new homes, accountability, that type of thing. He did have political ambitions, right? Like he ran against Doug Ford for the leadership. I think that there was a bit of looking over the shoulder from the Premier. Maybe he doesn't need to worry about that so much anymore. But it's a huge loss for the front bench. When it comes to the election, though, I've been hearing that a lot of people felt that Phillips couldn't have won that seat again. The electoral map obviously changed in 2018, but Ajax, that area, had before Phillips been represented by the Liberals, for a decade or more. Federally, it's Liberal too. So I think that maybe he wanted to bow out. This is me speculating. Obviously Phillips has his official line and all of that, but maybe he wanted to bow out, before that. I don't think that we've seen the end of his time in politics. He says he's going to go back to the private sector for now. But I think, we can't really forget about St. Bart's and that unauthorized vacation last winter during lockdowns. I know that the NDP and the Liberals, their candidates are already, in place, and that they've been reminding constituents in Ajax, like, remember your MPP did this. So I think generally, like we do not vote, like we vote for our MPP. And so I think that even though Phillips is very well respected, he's a strong politician. I think maybe voters on the ground at the doors, they didn't, that the St. Bart's trip rubbed them the wrong way. And I know that the opposition parties were reminding constituents about that every chance they got. So that'll be another interesting one to watch.
Yeah, well, Phillips will now have a bit more time to spend on the beach. So we'll move over to the New Democrats. They came up pretty close to winning in 2018. There was even some moments during the campaign where they're narrowly ahead of the PCs in the polls. They haven't really been able to maintain that. None of the polls, except for that one that just came out this week, but virtually none of the polls have had them growing from their 2018 position. So do they feel like they have a legitimate shot of forming government in this election, particularly in terms of winning more seats than the PCs?
I mean, it's actually really embarrassing for the NDP, I think. Like, they are official opposition, and they've, for the most part in the polls, they're still in third place. I think that even Andrea Horwath, she's been there for so long now. And so if they lose official opposition, like lose even a lot of seats to the Liberals, I think her leadership will definitely be in question. One thing that, I think has really hurt them is, and of course, there's still time to go towards the campaign, but it'll be interesting to see if they go left or right of center here, and what they want to do, because in 2018, they kind of pivoted towards the right, you could say. I know that angered a lot of dippers. And now we kind of see some of the promises from the Liberals, very bold and, lefty, you would call them lefty promises, a 4-day work week pilot, bringing back basic income, that type of thing. We haven't, obviously it's still early days yet. We haven't seen the platform yet from the NDP, but it'll be interesting to see if they can kind of outleft the Liberals here with some bold promises. I think they really need that. I think they've kind of, not really taken advantage of being official opposition. It's one thing to just criticize, but when you also want to be premier, you need to say what you'll do. And so sometimes when we're asking Andrea Horwath, if you were premier, what would you do? And she says, well, it's, not on her to do it. So I think that, they, maybe of all the parties, to me, they're not really in campaign mode as seriously as some of the others. But again, Steven Del Duca is not in the House. He can focus fully on the campaign. So there's a lot of factors at play here. I think, 2018 certainly was a change election, and it will be interesting to see how this kind of plays out between the Liberals and the NDP, especially in Toronto.
Yeah, well, my question for the PCs was, who is their opponent? And I guess it's the same thing for the NDP. Do they have to campaign against Del Duca, or do they have to campaign against the PCs? I know, like, geographically, it depends. In some places they have to do one or the other. But, if they're on the debate stage, which person is Horwath going to be turning to the most to criticize?
I mean, that's an interesting one. They've also taken out ads, the NDP, against Steven Del Duca as well. And so I do think that, they do see an opportunity there. Obviously, there's been, a very long history in this whole country of, the NDP versus the Liberals and that type of thing. So I think for sure we will see, a lot of hard campaigning against Steven Del Duca. And we haven't seen so many ads actually from Del Duca, but it's kind of how you define, it's who defines who first. So I think we're waiting to see how Del Duca plays this. But yeah, the NDP, they've been pushing hard against Steven Del Duca, and I think it makes sense. Like, obviously you need to. There are some voters there. Like, the NDP obviously picked up a lot of Toronto seats that the Liberals lost in 2018. So those seats will be very competitive between those two. And also the NDP are losing like a lot of their incumbents as well in ridings that they've held for a long time. I had mentioned Windsor, Essex. And I think we know, incumbents, they naturally tend to get a leg up. There's name recognition, you can run on your record, that sort of thing. So it'll be interesting to see where they are pouring their resources.
Yeah, well, yeah, and particularly for New Democrats, it always seemed to me that their incumbents are worth more than a Liberal or PC or conservative incumbent. It just, I guess, for in most places, if you're voting New Democrat, most of the time, you're voting for an opposition member, right? So you must very much like your local MP or MPP. So to lose an incumbent for the New Democrats, I think cost them a lot more. So yeah, some of those seats that they would normally count on in an election, they're going to have to fight for a little bit more. But if they were trying to figure out how to grow, they do need to take votes from the Liberals, but there's only 7 Liberal seats. They can't form a government with just 7 extra seats, right? So where do they try to take seats away from the PCs?
I think for sure it's going to be the GTA, even the outskirts there. They do have a lot of their candidates, the Scarboroughs, if I can lump those all together. Even going out in the 905 as well. I mean, the 905 is, competitive for everybody. It's a very vote-rich area. A lot of ethnic communities. We can say that. So I think, the 905, and even in 2018, a lot of those races were very close. Treasury Board President, conservative Pramit Zakaria, there wasn't very close there, even in Brampton, those spots as well. So I think we're also going to see a lot of promises that impact those ridings as well. Like there's a lot of controversial highway promises on the table right now, addressing traffic and congestion, a big deal for the 905. I think we're going to hear more about like auto insurance. We know that like Brampton has the highest rates there. So I think the 905 again is going to be very competitive, and that's and a lot of close races in 2018. I think the NDP will be pushing hard there.
For the Liberals, they have a big job ahead of them, right? They're coming from 7 seats. It's a little bit like the federal Liberals back in 2015. They were the third party. At the time, the federal Liberals had a plan. It was more or less a 2-election plan, right? Get back into maybe official opposition status in 2015 and then vie for government. For the Ontario Liberals, are they seriously imagining they can go from third to first, or are they trying to play a long game? What's their strategy in that sense?
So just if I can get into like the weeds here a little bit, it's really interesting because the Ontario Liberals, they their own constitution, their own rules. If Del Duca basically doesn't become premier, there's a leadership review. So obviously for Del Duca, the stakes are very high. Personally, I think he'll get another shot as leader. Even if he doesn't become premier, you mentioned it's like a huge gap he needs to make up. They've only got 7 out of 124 seats. But yeah, no, I do think that that's going to be it's going to be like it's going to play a big part in this as well. It's going to be up to, I think it's going to be more between the Liberals and the NDP. It'll be more about the promises kind of that are, and the platforms that get put out there. It's one thing to vote against somebody and it's another thing to vote for somebody. So if you have bold promises that can rally people to the polls, that's going to be where it counts.
Yeah, and Del Duca has been trying stuff. I mean, he's promising electoral reform, which I know is a dirty word for Liberals, after what the federal Liberals did. But they do seem to be like they're trying. They're swinging for the fences, to use a sports metaphor.
Yeah, they promised to get rid of those MZOs, those controversial orders that bypass planning to get stuff built. Okay, I should add there's a lot of exceptions there, but they are already coming out with these huge bold promises. They've been nominating candidates like crazy. We kind of mentioned that people don't really know Del Duca. He's not the most charismatic guy. So they've been pumping up their candidates quite a bit. And they do have, a pretty diverse ticket so far. Obviously, they've had the most candidates to nominate, the most ground to make up. So there's still a long way to go for them. But I think we're going to see, it's going to be more about the candidates, I think. And then maybe, more about Del Duca a little closer to the actual vote.
I want to talk just briefly about the fourth party, the Greens. They did win a seat in 2018, Mike Schreiner winning the seat of Guelph. For them, what is this campaign about? Guelph was won by pretty wide margin. I'm not sure if anybody thinks Schreiner is really in any danger. So are the Greens trying to win a second seat, and what would it be?
No, that's a great question. I mean, they always punch above their weight, the Green Party. I mean, Mike Schreiner, he's always really quick. Reporters love it, with his, reactions to whatever the government's doing. That's great. Get a comment right away. They're always punching above their weight. Just, to have one MPP there only so many resources, and they're really on top of things. And actually, that's kind of how it was historic in 2018 that Schreiner even got elected, the first Green MPP. And even, federally, just this last election, Ontario, elected a Green MP as well federally. So I do think that there is room for them to pick up. And their strategy in 2018 was to pour all their resources in Guelph, which is where Schreiner represents. So I think that, those spots, and again, maybe even in the 905 as well, obviously there's a lot of controversial highways are shaping up to be a big election issue. The Bradford bypass for the 413. We know the Greens are not happy about that. So I think that those areas, those campaigns, you might want to vote Green, just to, have the voice there in the House to be opposed to these projects, or what's happening to the green belt if you're not happy about it. So I don't know if I'm ready to say specific ridings. I think one interesting thing is that they do have a very high profile candidate, Diane Sachs, the former environmental commissioner, who's running for them in University Rosedale. Obviously, that has been Liberal territory for a while. It's NDP. So I don't know if the Greens can pick that one up, but obviously Diane Sachs is a very high profile candidate. She'll give them a run for their money there, I think.
Yeah, Annie Paul didn't seem to have much of an impact in downtown Toronto in the federal campaign, but maybe Kitchener Center, where they did win that seat, maybe that becomes an option for them. So we're going to be returning to the House. The House is returning when? In February?
Yes, scheduled for after the Family Day long weekend, so February 22nd. But it kind of feels like anything could happen these days. There's all these calls for an early return. There's fears that it might get pushed back, the House coming back. I mean, obviously, politically speaking, the pandemic situation isn't so great right now. So, getting yelled at in question period, and then having those clips on social media, maybe not the best thing for the PCs right now. And they haven't wanted to do virtual sitting. So for now, it's February 22nd, but I guess we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. And once that happens, what will be for you the main event? I assume it'll be the budget.
Yeah, the budget's going to be the big thing here. I'm hearing that it's could be a little later, but it is legally due out by March 31st. And obviously this is the pre-election budget. So any campaign goodies from the PCs, we'll see them there. Maybe a return of a buck of beer, which didn't quite pan out so well, I think. But I think a lot of election goodies will come through there. They can then, run on that. The closer to June that they release that, they can run on that, and as well as their platform too. I think we'll see a lot of long-term promises. And I think, we could see some legislation on housing affordability as well. That's obviously a big issue this week. And I think, a lot of talk about cost of living and how to help. Obviously the province can only do so much on that, but I think that, pocketbook issues besides the pandemic, I think are going to start to come up a lot.
Yeah, well, there'll still be lots to watch and lots to talk about. So we'll chat again before the election's called. So I really appreciate you, setting the table for this election year in Ontario. It's exciting.
Yeah, I'll be happy to debrief you guys anytime on all the drama.
All right. Thanks so much, Sabrina. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Sabrina and Nanji for that discussion. If you want to check out her newsletter, it's at qpobserver.com. There's also a link down in the descriptions. And if you missed it last week, you might want to check out my discussion with Dan Arnold, who was the Liberal campaign pollster over the last 3 elections. We had a really great discussion last week about everything that he saw during those campaigns, and particularly the 2021 election, and how the Liberals came up short with the majority government they were going for. You can check that out, I think, just around here. And if you like these videos, you should subscribe to this channel, which I think you can do over here. And I hope that you'll be commenting, sharing, liking these videos if you like them. And of course, check out the website, thewrit.ca. If you want to subscribe, that really helps me out. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.